The darkness of the Pennsylvania backroads had an unsettling stillness that night, broken only by the occasional flicker of headlights cutting through the thick air. Allison Green was gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual as her car coasted down Route 351. The road was infamous among locals, whispered about in hushed tones over campfires and late-night drinks. It was a road haunted by an urban legend, the Green Man. She had never given the stories much thought until tonight. Her hands were slick with sweat as she turned the corner, the trees towering on either side, closing in like watchful sentinels. The soft hum of her car's engine seemed to dim as her heartbeat thundered in her ears. Allison had promised herself she wouldn't drive through this road again at night. But here she was, alone, in the dead of night, with miles of nothingness stretching ahead of her. Her phone buzzed on the passenger seat, a message from her mom asking if she had arrived safely. She reached over to grab it when she saw something up ahead. A figure. It was faint, just a silhouette in the distance, illuminated only by her dim headlights. It was hunched over, moving slowly but deliberately down the side of the road. Allison's throat tightened. The stories began flooding back. Stories of a man with no face, his skin a sickly green, wandering the highways, searching for something or someone. Was this him? She slowed the car to a crawl, her pulse quickening as the figure grew closer. Whoever it was, they were wearing dark, loose-fitting clothes. His face, her breath caught in her throat as she squinted, trying to make out any features, but the darkness seemed to swallow him whole. Her hands trembled as her car coasted closer. Maybe it was just a homeless man, or someone who had broken down. But her gut twisted, telling her that this was something far more disturbing. With a shaky hand, Allison pressed the window switch, just an inch, enough to call out. "Hey," her voice cracked. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't stop, didn't turn, just kept walking. But the closer she got, the more certain she became that something was terribly wrong. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost mechanical, like someone going through the motions without any real awareness. She pulled the car over to the side, her heart pounding as she wrestled with the decision. Should she offer help, or should she keep driving and never look back? Every rational part of her screamed to leave, but something, some strange, morbid curiosity, compelled her to stay. She glanced around nervously, half expecting the figure to vanish the moment she looked away. But he was still there, trudging down the road, now only a few feet away from her stopped car. She could see him clearly now. His skin, dear God, his skin. It wasn't just green. It was disfigured, melted in places, the skin grafted in grotesque patches, as if it had been scorched by something far more sinister than fire. His eyes were small, sunken deep into his skull, giving him an almost skeletal appearance. And then in the dim glow of her headlights, Allison saw his face, or what was left of it. There were no eyebrows, no lips. The lower half of his face was twisted and malformed, his nose barely more than a scarred hole. He didn't look like a man. He looked like a ghost of someone who had once lived, a man whose humanity had been stripped away. She gasped, her breath catching in her throat as the figure paused, just for a moment, and turned his head ever so slightly toward her car. It was as if he could sense her fear, as though her presence had disturbed his solitary journey. Allison couldn't move. Her mind screamed at her to drive away, but her body was frozen in terror. She stared at the man, if he could still be called that, and for a split second, their eyes met. She expected to see malice, anger, or perhaps even violence in those hollow, sunken eyes. But instead, there was something unexpected. Pain. In that brief moment, Allison saw something profoundly human in his eyes, an agony that went far beyond the physical disfigurement. She had heard the stories, of course, about how the Green Man had been struck by lightning as a child, disfigured so horribly that he could no longer show his face in public. The story had been passed down from generation to generation, twisted and exaggerated with each retelling. Some said he was a vengeful spirit, stalking the roads in search of people to punish. Others claimed he was just a victim, cursed to walk alone in the darkness for eternity. But now, as she sat there staring into his eyes, Allison realized something else. This was not a ghost or a spirit. This was a man whose life had been shattered by unimaginable tragedy. The moment passed as quickly as it had come. The green man turned away from her and continued his slow, steady walk down the road. Allison's heart pounded in her chest as she watched him go. She knew she couldn't just leave him there, alone, not after what she had seen. Against her better judgment, she turned off the engine and got out of the car. Her feet felt like lead as she stepped onto the road, the night air cold against her skin. "Wait," she called out, her voice trembling. "Please, I just want to help." He didn't stop. He didn't even acknowledge her. But something in her refused to give up. She started walking, following him at a safe distance, her eyes fixed on his slow, deliberate movements. The night was eerily quiet. The only sound, the soft crunch of gravel under her feet and the faint rustle of leaves in the trees. Allison's mind raced as she tried to make sense of what she was doing. This was insane. She didn't know this man, didn't know what he was capable of. But there was a pull, a strange, inexplicable urge to keep going, to understand who he was and what had happened to him. After what felt like hours, the man finally stopped at the edge of a bridge. It was an old, rickety structure, barely wide enough for one car to pass. He stood there, staring out at the water below, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Allison hesitated, unsure of what to do next. She was afraid to get too close, afraid of what might happen if she startled him. But she couldn't just walk away now. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. Allison's footsteps were soft on the cracked pavement of the bridge as she approached the green man. He stood motionless, staring down at the black water below, the eerie glow of the moon casting long shadows over his distorted figure. Her mouth was dry, her body rigid with fear, but she knew she couldn't leave him like this. Are you all right?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. For a long moment, he didn't respond. He didn't move. But then, without turning, he spoke. His voice was rough, gravelly, like it hadn't been used in a long time. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped. "It's not safe." Allison swallowed hard, her mind racing. There was something deeply unsettling about the way he spoke, like he was warning her, but not in the way she had expected. It wasn't a threat. It was something else. A plea, maybe? "I know. She hesitated, searching for the right words. "I've heard the stories about you. People say things, but I think they're wrong." He let out a bitter, hollow laugh, still not turning to face her. "People are always wrong. They like their stories. They need them to be worse than the truth." Allison took another cautious step forward. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy. The night was so quiet, so still, that even her breathing seemed too loud. "What's the truth, then?" she asked softly. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then, in a voice so low she could barely hear it, he said, "The truth is, I was just a boy." Her heart clenched at the words. There was a sadness in his voice that cut through the fear, a raw and unfiltered pain that made her chest tighten. "I was just a boy," he repeated, his voice barely more than a whisper now. "And then it all went wrong." Allison took another step closer. She could see the way his shoulders slumped, the way his entire body seemed weighed down by something far heavier than his own physical scars. "Is that why you walk these roads?" she asked gently. "Because of what happened to you?" He was silent for a long time. The water below the bridge gurgled softly, as if the earth itself was mourning his story. "I walk because there's nowhere else to go," he said finally. "And because people like you, they come. They look for me. They need their monster." Allison's throat tightened. He was right. People had turned him into a legend, a ghost story to scare children. But standing there now, she could see that he was no monster. He was a man, broken, yes, but human. "I don't think you're a monster," she said quietly. He laughed again, that same hollow, bitter sound. "You will." Allison was caught off guard by the harshness of his response. She had been trying to understand, to reach out to him, but his bitterness was a wall she couldn't seem to penetrate. The night pressed in around them, thick with unspoken words. Allison stood frozen, the soft wind brushing through her hair as she stared at the green man's back. His silhouette against the dark expanse of the bridge made him seem even more isolated, like a man lost between two worlds. "I don't believe you," Allison said, her voice firmer now, surprising even herself. He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see the edge of his ruined face in the moonlight. "You don't understand. You don't know what people have done, the things they've said, how they look at me, like I'm not human." Allison's heart ached with a deep, profound sadness. She wanted to argue, to tell him that he was wrong, that he was still human no matter what he looked like. But something in the way he spoke, the weight of years of isolation and ridicule, made her realize that it wasn't that simple. "Maybe they're wrong," she said softly. "Maybe they're too afraid to see what's real. But I'm not afraid." He let out a dry, humorless laugh, finally turning to face her fully. "Not afraid? You don't even know what you're looking at." Allison held her ground, forcing herself not to flinch as his disfigured face came into full view. The skin, scarred and twisted, told a story of pain and suffering, but his eyes, those deep, hollow eyes, held something else, a flicker of humanity that hadn't been completely extinguished. "I see a man," she said quietly. "A man who's been through more than anyone should have to. But you're not a monster. You're just alone." He was silent, his gaze locking onto hers, as if searching for the lie in her words. When he found none, his shoulders sagged in defeat. "I used to be someone," he whispered, more to himself than to her. "Before the accident, before all of this, I had a life, I had a family. But then..." He stopped, as if the words were too painful to say aloud. Allison stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "What happened to you?" The green man was quiet for a long time, his head bowing slightly as he stared at the ground beneath him. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "I was a kid, just like any other. I didn't know what would happen when I climbed that electrical tower. I didn't know how dangerous it was. I was just curious, stupid maybe. The lightning hit me before I even knew what was happening. It burned me, took my face, my skin." Allison's breath caught in her throat as she listened. She had heard bits and pieces of this story before, in the local legends, but hearing it from him, hearing the truth, made it all too real. "When I woke up," he continued, his voice barely audible, "I wasn't me anymore. The doctors, they did what they could, but there's only so much they can fix. After that, no one wanted to see me. My parents couldn't even look at me. The kids at school, they called me a freak. People avoided me, like I was contagious." He laughed bitterly, the sound echoing in the still night air. "I became the thing they said I was. I stayed inside during the day, only coming out at night, when no one could see me. But even then, people talked. They saw me, wandering the roads, and they made up their stories. They needed a monster." Allison could feel tears stinging her eyes as she listened to his story, her heart breaking for the boy he had been and the man he had become. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He shook his head. "Don't be. It's just the way things are." "No," she said, stepping closer. "It doesn't have to be." The green man looked at her, confusion flickering across his face. "What do you mean?" Allison swallowed, her heart pounding in her chest. "You don't have to be alone. You don't have to hide anymore." He stared at her, as if the very idea was foreign to him. "What are you talking about?" "Look at me. Do you think anyone wants to see this? People are afraid of me, Allison. They're disgusted." Allison shook her head. "That's not true. You've just been hiding for so long that you believe it. But I'm not afraid of you. And I'm sure there are others who wouldn't be either." The green man took a step back, shaking his head in disbelief. "You're wrong. You're just saying that because you feel sorry for me." "I don't pity you," Allison said firmly. I want to help." He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Help? How can you help me? You can't fix this." Allison didn't know what to say. She knew she couldn't fix what had happened to him, but she also knew that he didn't deserve to live the rest of his life in hiding. "Maybe I can't fix what happened to you," she said quietly. "But you don't have to keep living like this. You don't have to keep punishing yourself for something that wasn't your fault." He turned away from her, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "You don't understand. You'll never understand what it's like to be trapped in a body that isn't yours, to be a prisoner in your own skin." Allison felt a lump rise in her throat. "No, I don't. But I know what it's like to be scared. I know what it's like to feel alone, and I don't think you should have to feel that way anymore." He didn't respond. He just stood there, staring out at the water, his back to her. Allison took a step forward, her voice soft. "Please, let me help you." For a long time, he didn't move. Then finally he turned to face her. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her he was considering her offer, even if he couldn't admit it. "Why are you doing this?" he asked quietly. "Why do you care?" Allison hesitated, searching for the right words. "Because no one deserves to feel like a monster." He stared at her for a long moment, as if weighing her words. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. Allison stood there, watching him go, her heart heavy. She had tried to reach him, but it hadn't been enough. Maybe it never would be. But as she turned to walk back to her car, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she had made a difference. That maybe, just maybe, she had planted a seed of hope in his heart. Days passed, and the encounter with the green man stayed with Allison. She found herself thinking about him constantly, wondering where he was, what he was doing. She had heard more stories from the locals, people claiming to have seen him walking the roads late at night, his green, disfigured face appearing in their headlights before vanishing into the darkness. But none of those stories matched the man she had met on that bridge. One evening, unable to shake the feeling that there was more she needed to do, Allison drove back to the same stretch of road where she had first seen him. The night was quiet, just like before, the air cool against her skin as she parked her car near the bridge. She didn't know what she was hoping for. Maybe she just wanted to see him again, to know that he was okay. Or maybe she needed to prove to herself that he was real, that the man she had spoken to wasn't just a figment of her imagination. As she stood by the edge of the road, staring out into the darkness, she heard it, a soft shuffle of footsteps. Her heart leapt into her throat as she turned toward the sound. There he was, walking slowly along the side of the road, just like before. "Hey," she called out, her voice echoing through the night. He paused, his head turning slightly in her direction. For a moment, he just stood there, as if debating whether to acknowledge her. Then, slowly, he began to walk toward her. Allison's heart raced as he approached, her palms sweating as she tried to think of what to say. "You came back," he said, his voice low and rough. "I did," Allison replied. "I wanted to see you again." He raised an eyebrow, though his expression was still hard to read. "Why?" Allison swallowed, searching for the right words. "Because I can't stop thinking about you, about what you said. I don't think you should be out here alone." The green man looked away, his jaw tightening. "I've been alone for a long time." "You don't have to be," Allison said gently. "There are people who would help you if you let them." He shook his head, his expression bitter. "Help me? No one can help me. They just want to stare, to point and whisper, to make up stories about me." Allison stepped closer, her voice soft but firm. "I'm not like them. I don't care about the stories. I care about you." He stared at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decide whether or not to trust her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know what you're trying to do, Allison, but it's not going to work. You can't save me." "I'm not trying to save you," she said. "I just want to be your friend." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. The green man looked at her in disbelief. The word friend seemed foreign, out of place. His mouth opened slightly as if he wanted to say something, but no words came. In all the years he had walked these roads hiding from the world, no one had ever offered him that, friendship. He had been a curiosity, a ghost, a monster in the shadows, but never a friend. "Why?" he asked, the confusion clear in his voice. "Why would you want that? Look at me." Allison felt the weight of his pain in those words, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she took a step closer. "Because I see more than what's on the outside. You've been through hell, and yet you're still here. That says something about you." The green man looked away, his fists clenching. "People like you say that now, but when you really look at me, you'll realize what I am. You'll run like the rest of them." "I'm not running," Allison said firmly. "I'm here. I don't care about the scars. I care about you." He turned his head slightly, his sunken eyes locking onto hers. For the first time, the bitterness in his face seemed to soften just a little. "You don't know me," he said quietly. "You don't know what it's like to live like this, to be trapped in this body, in this face." Allison's heart ached for him, but she didn't look away. "Then help me understand." For what felt like an eternity, he stood there, staring at her, his emotions a swirling storm behind his disfigured face. Then, slowly, he took a step forward. You really want to know? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Allison nodded, her pulse quickening. The green man took a deep breath, his gaze drifting away from her, as if he was looking into a past that only he could see. I used to be someone else, he began, his voice heavy with the weight of years of suffering. Before the accident, I had a life. I had a name. My real name was Raymond. Raymond Robinson. Allison's breath caught in her throat. Raymond Robinson. She had heard the name before, buried deep within the urban legends, but the name had always been overshadowed by the more grotesque tales of the Green Man or Charlie No-Face. He continued, his voice growing softer. I was a kid, just like anyone else. I didn't know what would happen when I climbed that electrical tower. I didn't know that one wrong step could change my entire life. He paused, his eyes dark with the memory. The lightning, it burned through me, destroyed my face, my hands. The doctors, they did what they could, but they couldn't fix me. And after that, I wasn't Raymond anymore. I was something else. Allison listened intently, her chest tightening with every word. What happened after the accident? Raymond let out a bitter laugh. I became the town freak. People didn't want to look at me. My parents, they couldn't even stand to be in the same room as me. So I started walking at night when no one would see me. I wandered these roads trying to find something. I don't know what I was looking for. Maybe peace. Maybe just a place where I didn't have to feel like a monster. Allison's eyes filled with tears. She had heard the stories, but the reality was far worse than she had imagined. Raymond, she said softly, you're not a monster. He shook his head. I became what they said I was. The stories, they spread. People said I haunted these roads, that I was looking for revenge. They started calling me the Green Man. And I just let it happen. It was easier than trying to fight it. Allison took another step closer, her heart breaking for the man in front of her. But you're still Raymond. You're still a person. You're not what those stories say. Raymond looked at her, his eyes searching hers for something. Maybe hope, maybe a lie. How can you say that? Look at me. I am looking at you, Allison said, her voice steady. And I see someone who's been through more than anyone should ever have to. But you're still here. You're still fighting. That's what matters. Raymond's jaw tightened, his emotions flickering across his face like a storm he couldn't control. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe, just for a moment, that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the darkness. Why are you doing this? He asked again, his voice barely audible. Why do you care? Allison took a deep breath, because no one deserves to be alone. The wind rustled through the trees, the soft sound filling the silence between them. Raymond stared at her, his emotions warring inside him. He had been alone for so long, had built walls so high that he didn't know how to tear them down. But here she was, this stranger, offering him a lifeline he hadn't known he needed. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, finally, Raymond nodded. I don't know how to do this, he admitted, his voice barely more than a whisper. I don't know how to be around people anymore. Allison smiled gently. That's okay. We'll figure it out. He looked at her, uncertainty flickering in his eyes. You really think it's that simple? No, Allison admitted, but I think it's worth trying. Raymond stared at her for a long moment, his mind racing. He had spent years hiding in the shadows, convinced that he was beyond saving. But now, standing here with Allison, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. In the weeks that followed, Allison returned to the bridge almost every night. Sometimes Raymond would meet her there, and they would talk about his past, about the life he had lost, and the life he had never had the chance to live. Other times, he wouldn't show up, and Allison would sit alone, wondering if he had finally decided to disappear for good. But each time she saw him, she noticed a change. He was still quiet, still guarded, but the bitterness that had once filled his voice was slowly fading. He was beginning to trust her, little by little. One night, as they sat together on the edge of the bridge, Raymond broke the silence. Do you ever wonder what your life would be like if one thing had gone differently? He asked, his voice soft. Allison thought for a moment. Yeah, I guess I do, but I try not to dwell on it. It's too easy to get stuck in the what-ifs. Raymond nodded, staring out at the water below. I used to think about it all the time. What if I hadn't climbed that tower? What if I hadn't been struck by lightning? What if... He trailed off, his voice thick with emotion. Allison placed a hand on his arm, offering silent support. I used to think that maybe I was supposed to die that day, he continued, his voice barely audible. That maybe it was a mistake that I survived. Allison's heart ached for him. You survived for a reason, Raymond. There's a reason you're still here. Raymond looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. What reason? Allison smiled softly. Maybe to remind people like me that monsters don't exist, that we create them when we refuse to see the humanity in others. For a long moment, Raymond didn't say anything, but then slowly he nodded. Months passed, and Allison and Raymond's friendship deepened. She learned more about his past, about the boy he had been before the accident, and about the man he had become in the years since. He wasn't the Green Man anymore, not to her. He was Raymond Robinson, a man who had been dealt a cruel hand but had refused to give up. One night, as they sat together on the bridge, Raymond turned to her with a serious expression. I want to do something, he said quietly. Allison raised an eyebrow. What is it? I want to go back, he said, his voice trembling slightly. I want to go back to town. I want to stop hiding. Allison's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this moment, hoping that one day he would be ready to face the world again. Are you sure? She asked gently. Raymond nodded, though there was fear in his eyes. I've been hiding for so long. I don't know what's going to happen, but I can't live like this anymore. I don't want to be a ghost. Allison smiled, her heart swelling with pride. You're not a ghost, Raymond. You never were. They made a plan. The next day, Allison would pick him up, and they would drive into town together. Raymond didn't know what to expect. Part of him feared the worst, that people would still look at him like a monster. But another part of him, the part that Allison had helped bring back to life, hoped for something better. The drive into town was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Raymond sat in the passenger seat, his hands clenched in his lap, his eyes staring straight ahead. He hadn't been back to town in years, and the thought of facing people again made his stomach churn. But Allison was by his side, her presence a calming force. She had been the one to show him that he wasn't alone, that he didn't have to be the Green Man anymore. As they pulled into the town square, Raymond's breath caught in his throat. People were everywhere, walking along the sidewalks, talking, laughing. For a moment, he wanted to tell Allison to turn around, to drive away and never come back. But then she looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and encouragement. You've got this, she said softly. I'm right here. Raymond took a deep breath and nodded. Slowly, he opened the car door and stepped out. At first, no one noticed him. The world moved around him as if he wasn't there. But then, one by one, people began to stop and stare. The whispers started, and Raymond could feel the weight of their gazes on him. The familiar feeling of being an outsider creeping back in. But this time, he didn't run. He stood tall, his heart pounding in his chest, and met their stares head-on. For a long moment, the square was silent. Then a little girl tugged on her mother's sleeve, pointing at Raymond. Mommy, who is that man? Her mother looked at Raymond, her eyes widening slightly. That's the Green Man. Raymond felt a lump form in his throat. The stories were still alive, still shaping how people saw him. But before he could turn away, the little girl smiled. He doesn't look scary. Her mother hesitated, then nodded slowly. No, he doesn't. And just like that, something shifted. The people who had been staring began to look away, returning to their conversations, their lives. Raymond stood there, his heart racing, as the fear and judgment he had expected never came. Allison stepped up beside him, her eyes bright with pride. See, you're not a monster. Raymond didn't say anything. He just stood there, taking it all in. The town, the people, the world he had been hiding from for so long. For the first time in years, he felt free. Over the following weeks, Raymond continued to return to town with Allison. He wasn't the Green Man anymore, at least not to the people who had once whispered about him in the dark. He was Raymond Robinson, a man who had survived unimaginable hardship but had come out the other side stronger. There were still moments of doubt, moments when the old fears crept back in. But with Allison by his side, Raymond learned to push through them, to keep going. One evening, as they sat together on the bridge where it had all started, Raymond turned to her, his voice soft. Thank you, he said, his eyes filled with gratitude. You saved my life, Allison. Allison smiled, her heart swelling with warmth. No, Raymond, you saved your own life. I just helped you see it. He looked out at the water, the last traces of sunlight casting a golden glow over the world. For the first time in a long time, Raymond felt at peace. I think I can finally stop walking, he said quietly. Allison placed a hand on his arm, her voice gentle. You're not alone anymore. Raymond nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. No, I'm not. And as the sun set behind them, the green man faded away, leaving only Raymond Robinson, a man, not a monster. The end.